Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio and I am presenting our first focus point for Chapter 1, which is Were the Peace Treaties of 1919 to 1923 fair? If you haven't seen the introduction video, you may want to stop and go back and take a look at the introduction before we get into the first focus point. So today we will focus on the first focus point of were the peace treaties of 1919 to 1923 fair? And this focus point is, what were the motives and aims of the Big Three at Versailles? So before we go into the content itself, I think it's very important to make sure that everyone is on the same page and we understand what are motives and what are aims. So the basic definition for motives is something that causes a person to act in a certain way. And aims is something intended or desired to be attained by one's purpose. Let's look at three examples that have nothing to do with history, by the way. She wants to lose weight. That's a motive. An aim would be to do 25 minutes of exercise. That particular aim is directly related to the motive, and that's how the two are connected. Let's look at a different example. John wants Mary's attention. John teases Mary. And finally, William wants a dog. What is his aim? He takes his mother to the SPCA in the hopes that this trip will help obtain that dog that he wants. But back to history, we're talking about what were the motives and the aims of the Big Three at Versailles. As a point of clarification, the Treaty of Versailles is one of the Versailles settlements that specifically focuses on what the fate of Germany would be at the end of the First World War. This was a conference which involved over 24 different nations, but there were essentially three individuals who were the most important. These three individuals are often referred to as the Big Three. Let's take a look at each one. The first was President Woodrow Wilson, representing the United States. Prime Minister Lloyd George, representing Great Britain. And Prime Minister Clemenceau, who represents France. It is these three individuals that essentially craft the Treaty of Versailles and decide what the fate of Germany will be. I think it's important to take a little bit of time to talk about each of these three individuals, give you some background information so you get to know them a little bit better. So let's begin with Woodrow Wilson. What did he believe? Many individuals will characterize Woodrow Wilson as what is known as an idealist. He is an individual who believes the best things are possible. And this is illustrated in what is known as his 14 points. Now, we're not going to go through every single one of the points, but there are several themes that I want you to pick up on. The first is that he was very concerned about what was happening in Europe at the time. Essentially, we're talking about the modern age about to happen. So Wilson believed that it was possible to kind of break down the old system of Europe and institute a new modern world. These items, which are listed here, include some of the main points which are part of his 14 points. He didn't want countries to have secret treaties. He wanted arms or militaries to reduce. He wanted countries to treat their colonies fair. He wanted open trade in Europe. He wanted self-determination. This is a term which means that people of a country who live in the country are the ones who rule that country, not people from an outside country imposing their laws on them. He essentially wanted to redraw the map of Europe. He wanted to promote democracy in Europe. And he also believed very strongly that in this modern age, countries had to work together in an international association. So essentially, his 14 points help to drive his beliefs as he goes to Paris to negotiate in the Versailles settlement. Our second individual is Clemenceau, who is the Prime Minister of France. Now, it would be fair to say that he is an unforgiving individual. He is a long-term politician. He was known at the time as the Tiger, and he was perhaps the oldest in the group and had really seen a lot of the history between France and its neighbor Germany, and he had lived through the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So, in many ways, he was motivated by a sense of revenge to get back at Germany for all the years of hardships that they had caused France through the years. At the heart of it, he wanted to strip Germany of any ability to wage war again. Now we have Prime Minister Lloyd George. He is what I would characterize as a pragmatic individual. Now, pragmatic means that he looks at situations not from the idealist point of view or the extremist point of view, but tries to look at the situation as it is and respond accordingly. His main beliefs deal with things such as he wants Britain to be competitive in business in Europe. He is fearful of the rise of communism. Remember, just before this, Russia, which was a monarchy, had fallen to communism, and he believed that it was possible that other countries in Europe could follow the same suit. He also was very conscious of the fact that Britain had a lot of colonies in Africa and also in Asia, but also in the New World. And he wanted to maintain Britain's colonies because they were a great source of income and raw materials. Britain is a seaward nation, so he wanted to make sure that its navy was strong, and he wanted to punish Germany for what they had done during the war, but he didn't want to punish them too hard. And we'll talk a little bit about why he wanted to punish them just a little later on. So, do you remember our scale that we talked about in the introduction? Here on one end, we have Woodrow Wilson, the idealist. We have Lloyd George right in the middle, a realist. And then we have George Clemenceau, the extremist, as one end. Just for the purposes of going back to our first video, I'll put the numbers up here to help put in a sense where each of these three individuals fall on our scale. So now let's get directly into the motives and aims of each of these individuals. The motives of Woodrow Wilson is that he wants to break the old system down. Remember that the US had not really been damaged that severely by the war. And in fact, the soldiers had only fought in the war essentially 2 years. They didn't enter the war until 1917. And Woodrow Wilson was motivated also by this idea of international cooperation. So the three main aims that Woodrow Wilson has is that he wants to break down this old secret alliance system. He doesn't want harsh penalties, known as reparations, imposed on Germany, and he also wants a League of Nations, a group of individuals that get together and solve their problems in a conference room, not on the battlefield. Now, you might have noticed reparations is a vocabulary word. What are reparations? Essentially, these are payments which are given to the country who wins a war. It can be money, it can be land, And reparations could also include things such as placing blame on a country. As a reminder, Woodrow Wilson did not believe that harsh reparations were needed to be imposed on Germany. Now, let's get into the motives of Clemenceau. He wants to destroy Germany. France was severely damaged by the war, and he was also scared of being invaded again. We can take a minute just to look at the chart, which is here on the left-hand side. You can see that almost 1.5 million French people died during the war, compared to only 100,000 by the United States. Look at civilian deaths, how different the numbers are. US, 100. France, 300,000. I think that this chart really helps to put in place why Clemenceau feels so much differently than Woodrow Wilson. Aims: he wants to humiliate Germany. He wants huge reparations, money, land, and guilt. And he wants to take away the fighting force of Germany so France will be safe in the future. All right, so let's talk about Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain. What are his motives? He doesn't want to break the current system. They were damaged by the war, but not as severely as France. Remember, the war was mainly fought on European soil, and there were no battles that were actually fought on the land in Great Britain, which means that most of Britain was untouched by the war. Lloyd George also wants to prevent future wars, but he also doesn't want the balance of power in Europe to change. If Germany is really hit hard, for example, then France might become more powerful, or the communists in the Soviet Union may become more powerful. So he's trying to maintain the current structure as is. His aims are to keep Germany viable, which means essentially still operating. He wants small penalties placed on Germany, and he wants to make sure that France is safe so future wars are prevented. On the left, we have a map of Europe, and we'll talk a little bit about this a little later in the video when we talk about the Rhineland and how this area will be demilitarized. One of the other important things that we'll talk about, especially in our next video series, is that Lloyd George is sort of the voice of reason to Francis Clemenceau. And essentially, one of the main aims that he has at the conference is to talk Clemenceau off the ledge and soften some of these hard opinions that Clemenceau has. So let's get into the main terms of the Treaty of Versailles. This is essentially what the big three hammer out and decide what terms of surrender will be given to Germany. I think it's very important, just as a reminder, to remember that Germany was not present at these talks, and essentially whatever the big three came up with, Germany essentially had to accept. This will be a big bone of contention later on. First clause is that Germany and her allies had to take full responsibility for starting the war. Second, Germany would have to pay reparations. Many individuals would consider these reparations to be very high. Third, Germany would have to disarm. Germany would not be allowed to have a large military. It would have to reduce its navy. It would not be allowed to have tanks, and also no conscription. Conscription is essentially a word that means that the government cannot recruit ordinary civilians into the military. Fourth term, territory. Germany and her allies would lose territories to other countries, or they would be taken away for a period of time. So let's take a brief minute to visualize these territorial changes that take place. So before World War I, the most dominant country in Europe is Germany. On its western border is France and two other smaller countries, Belgium and Holland. On its eastern border is Poland. Now, just for clarification, there are other countries, of course, which are here, but play less important role in the overall story of the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things that's important to remember is that the First World War began when Germany invaded France, and it did so by invading through Belgium. So essentially, some of the things that we see with the territorial changes at the Treaty of Versailles is to correct the current situation in Europe. After World War I, little areas of Germany are taken away from it and first are given to Belgium. This is done in order to provide a little bit more protection to Belgium. Another important territorial change was the area of Alsace-Lorraine, which was a part of Germany, but was taken away and given to France. This area has a long history of being controlled by France and Germany back and forth. And even when you visit today, all the signs in these areas are in French and in German. There is a town, for example, known as Zweibrücken, which is the German name, but the French refer to it as Dupont. So it's a really interesting area where these two countries come together. The other thing which was very important about the treaty is that essentially the western area of Germany, which is known as the Rhineland, had to be demilitarized. And the purpose behind this is that France believed that having this little buffer between them and Germany would essentially help to keep them safer. On the eastern side, there were also important territorial changes. Germany would be essentially split into two, where you have East Prussia, and then in between it, area that belonged to Germany would be given to Poland. And the main idea behind this is so Poland would have access to the sea, which is to the north. And then finally, there were certain areas of Germany which would become plebiscites. Danzig in the north, the Saar region, which is in the Rhineland area. Essentially, these would be taken away from Germany for a certain amount of time, and then eventually a referendum would be held to decide whether or not they wanted to return to Germany. So think about our two maps. What Europe looked like before the war and then afterwards. Do these territorial changes make things more complicated or make things easier? I'll let you decide. So finally, the last term, which is noteworthy of the Treaty of Versailles, is the League of Nations. Essentially, what it says is that the nations of Europe will work together to solve their problems. And as you may have guessed, this contribution to the treaty comes straight out of Wilson's 14 points. He is sort of the father of this idea. So that essentially brings us to the end of our first focus point, motives and aims of the big three, and how these issues help to better explain this post-war era for Germany. I want to thank you for joining me today, and please take a look at our Google Classroom site for more support materials, including this particular PowerPoint presentation, which you can view and download. Thanks for joining me today.